All right, what is up, everybody? Today we're going to be getting into what's actually inside the S&P 500, and we're going to break it down. So, disclaimer: this is not for, this is only for educational purposes only. Please talk with the financial advisor for further information. Read this if you'd like. So, first off, the S&P 500 is not equal across all 500 companies. Not every company in the S&P 500 has the equal amount of weighting as do the top companies. As can be seen in this chart, Apple having the largest portion of the pie, being at 6.7%, and as you go down to Microsoft, Nvidia, and so forth, it dwindles down to the 10th stock being at 1.3%. And then the rest of the 490 other stocks would be 68% of the total S&P 500. So the top 10 hold quite a bit of weight. And just this reiterates what I was mentioning earlier. The S&P 500 is not an equal weight. Not all the companies inside of it have 0.1 holding for all of them. They're not all equal. It's very heavy on the larger companies. It's more weighted by market cap than anything else. So, and this goes more into it. The top 10 stocks hold 32%, or are 32% of the S&P 500. The holdings make up that amount, and the remaining 490 stocks are 68% of the S&P 500. So this goes into it a little more. Apple has 7 times more stock, or more weighting, I should say, more weighting in the S&P 500 than ExxonMobil or JP Morgan Chase or Johnson & Johnson. The larger the company, typically a lot of time, the larger percentage is allocated to it in the S&P 500. And as of late, Nvidia has been doing really, really well. And so this, they may be the number one position with the next update. And this is a moving, the positions move a lot, just depending on how large every company is. So this isn't really set. It'll change over time depending on how well a company is and how large they are. And this goes down into the breakdowns of the sectors. So majority of the S&P 500 can be seen as going to information technology, which is almost a third of the entire pie. It's at 29%, so it's almost a third, and it's a large portion of the pie just because it's really hard to avoid tech. Almost everything has tech in it these days. Almost every company is tech related, and there's so many industries within tech as well. But following that, healthcare is at 13.1%, and financial services would be at 12.4%, which essentially is things like bank stocks, JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, etc. They have a pretty good sized portion of the pie. And consumer discretionaries would be companies like Costco, other Walmart, grocery store related stuff, and some other industries like it. And you can keep going down the line, and further you go around the wheel, you get down to materials at 2.2%. So all this to say, essentially, the S&P 500 holds a little bit of everything. It's not just tech alone. Now, tech has a large weight in the S&P 500, but it isn't all tech. So if tech doesn't do well, there's a lot of other things in the S&P 500 that also do well. Well, can do well to not make the index go down as much. So, and not all the companies are household names. Companies like these companies pass the 200 mark on the S&P 500. Most people may not know these companies. Some people might know Grainger, but majority of these, most people don't know what Laharis Technologies is, and I probably butchered that name, but most people, once you get past like the 200, the 150 mark, and especially past like the 300-400 mark, most people don't know those companies, and some people see it as a disadvantage because they could see it as like something that can hold you back, that, or dead weight, that are just in some eyes as useless holdings, because there are some companies within the S&P 500 that really haven't done anything for the past 20 years but are still part of the S&P 500 just because it is a large company and it is one of the top 500 companies, publicly traded companies in the United States. So companies like ExxonMobil, they haven't really moved that much, but obviously Apple has over the past 20 years. And since ExxonMobil is one of the largest oil-related companies, or one of the largest companies in the United States, the S&P 500 has a little bit of that, and it gives you, it also is a little bit of safety too, because it exposes you to everything. But it also, you also get exposed to some companies that may not do as well, but it does have a little bit of safety because there's a lot of diversity within it. So, but another thing to get into as well is that there are different types of S&P 500 ETFs, or stocks that mirror the S&P 500. And these two examples, VOO and SPY, would be those examples. There's a few others, but these are relatively the two biggest ones, I want to say. And one's from Vanguard and one's from SPDR. They're essentially down the line identical. Nothing really is different from them, just because they literally mirror the S&P 500. So whatever the S&P 500 is, that's what their holdings are. So there really is no difference between the two, other than the company name and potentially the expense ratio, which is essentially the fee you pay every year for the management. That's just the management fee. So this gets into your top holdings when you have a weighted index like this. Move the portfolio a lot. So your top 10 holdings can move the entire index dramatically. For example, like if the top 5 stocks went up 10% in the S&P 500, if they went up 10%, the whole index could go up 2%, and vice versa. Go down 10%, it can go down 2%. Whereas if you're looking at the last 100 stocks, if they went down 10%, that probably wouldn't move the S&P 500 relatively at all, or really much, just because they would have such a small percentage of the S&P 500 that it really wouldn't most likely affect it that much. And so the top 10 stocks probably have way more weight in the S&P 500 than the bottom like 100 or 150 or 200. So, and this is another thing that's very important. The companies within the S&P 500 get rotated every year. Typically, on average, about 20, according to the slide, about 20 companies get replaced every year, roughly 4% of the index. So this is a really nice feature that people like a lot. It takes out the guesswork of figuring out if someone to make their own S&P 500 holdings, all the management, all the swapping in and out of companies. It makes it a lot easier. So it makes the holdings get a lot easier. So the thing is, though, this next slide, this kind of gets into how the largest companies in the S&P 500 are 90% of the whole entire U.S. market cap, and small business is only 10%. So this is relatively to show that large businesses in the United States kind of dictate how, well, no. Essentially, this is to show that the S&P 500, whatever it does, is pretty much the heartbeat of the United States. So however the S&P 500 is, or NASDAQ 100 as well, it kind of can relatively show how well America is doing essentially. And if you bet on America, pretty much you're invested in the S&P 500 or companies in the U.S. obviously. But if America, the United States does pretty well over the next coming years, the S&P 500 most likely will do good as well. But to get back to this slide, the rotating in and out of 20 companies every year. I didn't mention this as well, but the weightings for every stock get changed as well. So if a company gets larger, they'll allocate a lot more to that stock, and if a company gets smaller, they'll allocate less. And this will, happen automatically. And the expense ratio that I mentioned earlier is a fee that someone pays for all this stuff to happen for them. And the expense ratio for S&P 500 indexes relatively are pretty small. They're not big at all. I mean, it's like 0.1% a year, which is relatively nothing, especially, considering someone would be managing for you 500 companies and how much is allocated to them and the percentages for each individual one, which makes life a lot easier for most people. So it's a lot easier of a way of holding a lot of stocks without having to focus in on how much to have to what. It makes it a lot easier just holding an indexed ETF. But the problem with holding the S&P 500 is that most people may not care about this, but you do give away your voting rights. So you won't be able to say or vote for anything within a company if you hold an ETF. The ETF, I guess, they take that away. You won't have that right. But most people really don't care about this. Most people just want the exposure to the S&P 500 and can passively throw money in it, every month on a 401k or the Roth or whatever, and just let it do what it's got to do. And that's what most people do. But people also ask as well, is the S&P 500 a good investment? This is asked a lot. People also ask a lot of times too, is it a good time to buy the S&P 500, as well? Is it good to buy it at a peak? Because especially in the past few weeks, past few months, the S&P 500 has been hitting, all-time highs pretty much many of the days. And so people ask, well, should I buy, if we're up so much, right? Well, this chart essentially shows the S&P 500 over the past 25 years. And since then, the S&P 500 has done over 350% since then. Whereas the other purple line I have on here, let me get my pen. Whereas the purple line, or pink line, or whatever color that is, magenta, that line is the inflation since the year 2000. So over the past 25 years, inflation has rose by 88%. So the S&P 500 since then has outpaced inflation, at least according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So your money has, if someone invested in the year 2000, held the S&P 500 since then, they would have beat inflation. But as someone can see in the very beginning, they didn't do as well in the years following after the dot-com bubble. And then they did kind of well, and then the financial crisis happened. They didn't do well then. And then subsequent years, it's done pretty well. And then after that, the S&P 500 has been an absolute tear for the past 10 years and has really outpaced inflation. But for this first, for that first decade, that must have been pretty rough for most people. Granted, though, you are buying at the top of the dot-com bubble, but throughout that time, you do lose to inflation. If someone did buy at the dot-com bubble, they would have lost to inflation for many years, but that's assuming that if they just put a lump sum at the top of the dot-com bubble. So, and this chart gets a lot worse if they invested in the NASDAQ 100, because obviously the dot-com bubble was a lot more tremendous on tech stocks. And luckily the S&P 500 holds a little bit of everything. But yeah. But yeah, so, and to answer the question, essentially, most people think that, at this peak, was it a good time to buy? People thought at this peak it was a good time to buy. People at this peak thought it was a good time to buy. People at this peak would ask, "Hey, is it a good time to buy?" And people at that peak would ask if it was a good time to buy. And those peaks, they look pretty bad. I mean, most people looking at each individual one of those peaks and been like, well, the stock fell right after that. That may not have been a good time to buy, right? And which, is true in some sense that, yeah, it did suck relatively after those times. But historically speaking, I mean, any of those times, whether it's the crash after COVID or the crash or the decline in year 2022 or financial crisis or the dot-com bubble, the S&P 500 is higher than any of those times. So buying at any of those times, someone would be in the positive. So, even in the most recent dip, before the tariffs, someone would be up slightly on that one even. So I'm not saying past results, equal future results, but if someone's willing to, to bet on the United States and think that we're going to be doing well over the next, couple decades with tech or just overall, I mean, they may be interested in that, So let's get into the next one. So essentially, to break down everything, what essentially you're buying for the S&P 500 is a very tech-heavy index. And it's a good majority of tech. I mean, the top 5 companies are almost all tech. NVIDIA's tech, Apple's tech, Google, Microsoft, so on and so forth. Almost all of them are tech. And that's mostly because people are piling money into them, thinking that they're going to do even better in the future. So, they get a larger market cap, and so they get more space in the S&P 500. And so that's why there's a lot more, heavier set in it, most likely. The S&P 500 is also dominated by 10 companies, 10 companies. Like mentioned before, they hold 30 something percent, or roughly a third of the S&P 500. So whatever they do, the S&P 500 definitely gets affected by it. If the top 10 companies flatline, the S&P 500 will struggle. So that's worth keeping in mind. But the flip side, though, is that it's still one of the best passive tools in history. I mean, just merely dumping, or not dumping, putting a little bit of money into the S&P 500 over the past 40 years, or 20 years, 10 years, 1 year, 50 years, 100 years, has historically done well for, anybody who's done that. So, not saying that's going to happen again, or it's going to continue like this, because there was a time in the 70s and 80s where it did flatline. But we're up, significant amounts since then. So even if someone did flatline for that, the time in the 70s and did nothing for 10 years, historically, if they kept holding on to it for the next decade, well, that was the 90s, and that was the dot-com bubble, and, obviously the market had a crazy ride, in those years. So, the market's obviously going to have its ups and downs, but, if the United States keeps doing well, like it's done over the past 100 years, or I guess, on the flip side, if they keep, printing money or lowering interest rates, the market, could do well. So, based on all this information, it's kind of up to whoever's wanting to buy into it to determine if it's for them or not. So, anywho, if you like this video, please subscribe, and I'll see you next time. See ya. Peace.